Chapter 26. The History of Economics. I am sure that the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas. John Maynard Keynes. People have been talking about economic issues, and some writing about them, for thousands of years, so it is not possible to put a specific date on when the study of economics began as a separate field. Modern economics is often dated from 1776, when Adam Smith wrote his classic, The Wealth of Nations. But there were substantial books devoted to economics at least a century earlier, and there was a contemporary school of French economists called the Physiocrats, some of whose members Smith met while traveling in France, years before he wrote his own treatise on economics. What was different about The Wealth of Nations was that it became the foundation for a whole school of economists, who continued and developed its ideas over the next 2 generations, including such leading figures as David Ricardo, 1772 to 1823, and John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. And the influence of Adam Smith has to some extent persisted on to the present day. No such claims could be made for any previous economist, despite many people who had written knowledgeably and insightfully on the subject in earlier times. More than 2,000 years ago, Xenophon, a student of Socrates, analyzed economic policies in ancient Athens. In the Middle Ages, religious conceptions of a fair or just price and a ban on usury led Thomas Aquinas to analyze the economic implications of those doctrines and the exceptions that might therefore be morally acceptable. For example, Aquinas argued that selling something for more than it was paid for could be done lawfully when the seller has improved the thing in some way, or as compensation for risk, or because of having incurred costs of transportation. Another way of saying the same thing is that much that looks like sheer taking advantage of other people is often, in fact, compensation for various costs and risks incurred in the process of bringing goods to consumers or lending money to those who seek to borrow. However far economists have moved beyond the medieval notion of a fair and just price, that concept still lingers in the background of much present-day thinking among people who speak of things being sold for more or less than their real value, and individuals being paid more or less than they are really worth, as well as in such emotionally powerful but empirically undefined notions as price gouging. From more or less isolated individuals writing about economics, there evolved, over time, more or less coherent schools of thought, people writing within a common framework of assumptions, the medieval scholastics, of whom Thomas Aquinas was a prominent example, the mercantilists, the classical economists, the Keynesians, the Chicago School, and others. Individuals coalesced into various schools of thought even before economics became a profession in the 19th century. The Mercantilists. One of the earliest schools of thought on economics consisted of a group of writers called the Mercantilists, who flourished from the 16th through the 18th centuries. In a motley collection of writings, ranging from popular pamphlets to a multi-volume treatise by Sir James Stewart in 1767, the Mercantilists argued for policies enabling a nation to export more than it imports, causing a net inflow of gold to pay for the difference. This gold they equated with wealth. From this school of thought have come such present-day practices as referring to an export surplus as a favorable balance of trade, and a surplus of imports as an unfavorable balance of trade, even though, as we have seen in earlier chapters, there is nothing inherently more beneficial about one than the other, and everything depends on the surrounding circumstances. The inevitable gropings of pioneers include inevitable ambiguities and errors, and economics was no exception. Some of the errors of the mercantilists, which have been largely expunged from the work of modern economists, still live on in popular beliefs and political rhetoric. However, there is a coherence in the writings of the mercantilists if we understand their purposes as well as their conceptions of the world. The purposes of the mercantilists were not the same as those of modern economists. Mercantilists were concerned with increasing the power of their own respective nations relative to that of other nations. Their goal was not the allocation of scarce resources in a way that would maximize the standard of living of the people at large. Their goal was gaining or maintaining a national competitive advantage in aggregate wealth and power over other nations, so as to be able to prevail in war, if war occurred, or to deter potential enemies by one's obvious wealth that could be turned to military purposes. A hoard of gold was ideal for their purposes. In a typical mercantilist writing in 1664, Thomas Munn's book England's Treasure by Foreign Trade declared the cardinal rule of economic policy to be to sell more to strangers yearly than we consume of theirs in value. Conversely, the nation must try to produce at home things which now we fetch from strangers to our great impoverishing. Mercantilists focused on the relative power of national governments, based on the wealth available to be used by their respective rulers. Mercantilists were by no means focused on the average standard of living of the population as a whole. Thus, the repression of wages by imposing government control was considered by them to be a way of lowering the cost of exports, creating a surplus of exports over imports, which would bring in gold. The promotion of imperialism and even slavery was acceptable to some mercantilists for the same reason. The nation, to them, did not mean a country's whole population. Thus, Sir James Stewart could write in 1767 of a whole nation fed and provided for gratuitously by means of slavery. Although slaves were obviously part of the population, they were not considered to be part of the nation.